The two most recent 135mm lenses on the Sony E-mount platform are probably the most interesting. One of those that was released last year is the Viltrox LAB series 135mm f1.8, and then we have the new contender, which is the Sigma 135mm f1.4, the world's first f1.4. I thought I would take advantage of having these two lenses at the same time to give you one of my head-to-head comparisons, because I suspect that these lenses might get cross-shopped a bit. And those of you that are trying to decide on whether or not you want a 135mm lens, which one to go with, there are definitely some really compelling options here. Now, both of them have a really obvious advantage over the other. In the case of the Viltrox, it retails for under $900 US, whereas the Sigma comes in at $1,900. That's a $1,000 difference. That's pretty obvious. But of course, the Sigma is the world's first with an f1.4 aperture at this 135mm focal length. And as we're going to see, that does give it some advantages. So what I have done is I have worked off of a tripod and I have done a series of comparison shots. Everything from chart testing to portrait work, and then of course a lot of things in between, trying to look at the bokeh quality, the various optical qualities along the way. And so today we're going to do a series of comparisons, and at the end of the video we'll do that actual deep dive into those head-to-head if you want to see all of that. But in the short term, I'm going to look at the things that are similar between these lenses, the things that are different, and what I consider to be the advantages for each one, and so you can make a more informed decision as to which one is your winner. Sound interesting? Let's dive in and find out. Now, in interest of a future showdown, just to let you know, I am filming on another one of these brand new Sigma lenses, in this case the 35mm f1.2 Mark II, and I will be putting that head-to-head with another Viltrox lens, the LAB 35mm f1.2. So stay tuned for that in the future. Let's start by talking about some of the things that are similar between these lenses. They do have a mostly similar feature set, and so that includes the ability to have complex aperture control, be able to declick the aperture, do aperture racking, things like that. They have an auto AF/MF switch, they have custom or function buttons, and so the ability to control various features like that. They both have thorough weather sealing, starting with a gasket at the lens mount, and then seals throughout the lens, and a special coating on the front to resist fingerprints and moisture. Both of them have roughly similar autofocus speed. They both have dual focus motors, advanced focus motors, and autofocus is near instant. And you can see here, whether we're looking at the Sigma or at the Viltrox autofocus, that both of them are achieving, really snappy results back and forth. Not enough difference there, I think, really to distinguish the two. Neither one of them have any issues with fringing, be it longitudinal style or lateral style chromatic aberrations, and we'll see that a bit more in one of our tests at the optical breakdown at the end. Both being third-party lenses suffer from the same limitations here on the Sony platform that I'm testing. Namely, you can't shoot any faster than 15 frames per second on any of the sport bodies, and they also don't have access to things like focus breathing compensation. And so those are going to be limitations that they both have to deal with. Neither one of them has teleconverter compatibility, and that would be true here on Sony because they're third-party lenses, but neither one of them are designed for use with teleconverters either. And so both of them share those limitations. Now, one obvious difference that I'm just going to call a neutral difference is that because the Sigma is bigger and heavier, it does have a tripod collar and foot here. And so for some of you, that might be a plus, because if you're working off of a tripod, having that ability could be good. However, with the Viltrox lens, it doesn't have one, and neither have I ever looked for one. And of course, it needs a little bit less because it's hard to call this lens smaller and lighter, but in this case, it actually is. And so that's a distinction there, but I'm not sure that it is really a pro or a con because of the way that it plays out. So let's start by talking about some reasons to choose last year's LAB series lens. The first and most obvious of those, as we mentioned in the intro, is the price. It retails for, the MSRP is $899 US. But with a discount code, one's available down in the description, you can drop that price by about 5% and get more into the $850 range, whereas the Sigma lens has an MSRP of $1,899 US, so at least a $1,000 difference between the two. That's obviously huge. You can buy two of these for the price of the one Sigma and have a little bit of change left over there. Also, the lab lens, because it has an LCD screen and a different kind of implementation here, it actually has the ability to customize it a little bit more. It has two function buttons, as does the Sigma lens, but whereas the Sigma buttons will only work redundantly, you can actually program a different function to each of these lenses through Viltrox's app, and so that you can actually set like AB focus, for example, and so do instant focus pulls to that. So you have a focus distance scale, little things like that. And so Viltrox definitely took a little bit more risk when it comes to the development of their design, but it does give you a few more options there. Another interesting advantage for the Viltrox that is lacking on the Sigma, one that I'm surprised by, is that the Viltrox does have a focus limiter switch. That can be useful, obviously, if you're trying to constrain your range to exclude close focus or to only shoot at close focus. And whereas with the Sigma, you're stuck shooting the full range all of the time. That's probably more useful on the Viltrox because that leads us to another advantage for the Viltrox, and that it has the ability to focus down much more closely into the like 70 centimeter range as opposed to the 110 centimeter range for the Sigma. And the resulting magnification is much higher on the Viltrox, a 0.25 times magnification or a 1:4 ratio, whereas we have more like a 0.144 times magnification here on the Sigma lens. So as you can see, that is radically different. Now, while neither one of these lenses suffers much from vignette, the Viltrox has less, and it more obviously has much less distortion. It basically has zero distortion and zero vignette, whereas the Sigma has a little bit more vignette, but more importantly, it has a pretty obvious amount of pincushion distortion. So definitely an optical advantage there for the Viltrox. The Viltrox, although it is a big, heavy lens, a year ago we were complaining about how this was bigger and heavier than all of the other 135 millimeter options on the platform. It now has ceded that to the Sigma. And so it is actually nearly 200 grams lighter. It is about 19 millimeters narrower in diameter. And while it is a hair longer, what you mostly see is that big diameter up front that is much larger on the Sigma due to having that f1.4 maximum aperture. The other thing that comes out of that is that the lens hood for the Viltrox is kind of what you might call a normal size, whereas the hood for the Sigma is what you might call massive. And so you can see here that that hood for the Sigma just goes easily all around the entire diameter of the Viltrox lens, whereas here, if you tried to put this hood on the Sigma, you can see that there's a lot of room to spare. And so these two hoods are just, the Sigma's hood is massive. I can drop the hood of the Viltrox inside of it. And so that's certainly a factor that you might want to consider. One other thing while we're looking up front is that the Viltrox has a very common 82 millimeter front filter thread. That's what basically all the other 135 f1.8 lenses on Sigma have. And whereas on the Sigma, we have a very large 105 millimeter front filter thread. So filters are not only going to be more expensive, they're also less common. And in this case, with a fast maximum aperture, you might want filters. And so, particularly like an ND filter, which means you're going to be spending even more money to purchase filters to cover that, whereas you'd be more likely to have 82 millimeter filters, and if you don't, they are cheaper than 105 millimeter filters. So how about some reasons to choose the new Sigma instead? Well, the obvious reason is the trade-off for that big maximum aperture is that it is a big maximum aperture. It is 2/3 of a stop brighter than the f1.8 of the Viltrox lens, and so that means it's able to let in a lot more light, and that comes with a lot of different advantages that we'll detail here. One of those is that it comes with bigger, softer bokeh highlights. And so definitely if you're looking at specular highlights and an apples to apples comparison, the ones on the Sigma are much obviously bigger and softer. It also means that you do have some other bokeh advantages, and just kind of the optical signature. I feel like the Sigma lens is a bit smoother in the transition zone and has just a smoother transition from focus to defocus as a byproduct. It also is going to demonstrate better low light performance. And one of the great applications I found with the Sigma is that it's really fantastic for doing something like deep sky astrophotography. And so shooting at night, it's got low vignette, it's very sharp, and it's very bright. And so it's really useful for that. More so there than what the Viltrox is going to be because it's sucking in that much more light. I also find that while, as I said, Viltrox took some risk with the implementation of their having LCD screen and the way that it functions with the aperture ring, I vastly prefer the traditional aperture ring here that comes with the Sigma. It just works more efficiently. It's less glitchy. Even on my copy of the Viltrox, what shows up on the LCD screen doesn't perfectly line up with the aperture stops, and so it's not perfectly calibrated. So it's little things like that that aren't a big deal, but they're kind of annoying, and the Sigma just feels like it's better implemented. Now, I critiqued the Sigma for the size of the hood, but one thing I do like better between the two lenses, and that is the simple fact that the Viltrox hood, it doesn't stay locked into place nearly as well. Whereas the Sigma hood, while it is massive, it actually has a dedicated lock, and so it's not going to be slipping around at all. You do have to release that lock to release the lens hood, but it's just much more reliable than this Viltrox hood, which just doesn't stay on right, and so I do find that a bit annoying there. And finally, Sigma has been making lenses for a long time, and it shows. They're just a little bit more polished in their general presentation than what Viltrox is with the Lab series. This Lab series represents Viltrox trying some new things. And some of those things that I like, some of the things I don't like as much. But I will say generally, I find that the Sigma just feels like a little bit more mature, less quirky product than what the Viltrox does. So that leads me to my conclusion. Both of these lenses, as you're going to see if you stick around for the optical comparison, they are amazing optically. They're just some of the very best lenses that I have tested. They both actually have really, really good autofocus that is fast, accurate, quiet in operation. As I've just said, I feel like the Sigma feels like a little bit more mature product. And obviously that f1.4 aperture does come with some certain assets. But the Viltrox has truly unbelievable image quality, in some ways even a little bit better than the Sigma, as we'll see. And obviously you can get that for way less money. It's also, of course, smaller and lighter, and that's going to be a consideration. So I would say buy the Sigma if you just desperately want that f1.4 aperture and the things that it can accomplish. And there are some true values that come with that. But if f1.8 works for you, save your money and buy the Viltrox because it remains a stunningly good lens optically that really works beautifully well for a whole lot less money, less than half in fact. And that is a pretty compelling argument for it. Now, if you want more information, you have a couple of options. In the description down below, there are links to my full reviews on both of these lenses, and I have thoroughly tested them in both video and text form, and you can find those in the description down below. Now, if you want to see how they compare optically in all of those head-to-head situations that I described, stay with me right now, and we're going to dive into that together. So we'll go through a series of comparisons here. Always, I'm going to keep the Sigma on the left side and the Viltrox on the right side, so you know what you're looking at. Starting here with vignette and distortion, you can see that in both of these metrics, the Viltrox takes a win. It has basically no measurable distortion and almost no measurable vignette here on E-mount, whereas while the Sigma has a low amount of vignette, you can see that it does require some correction, and quite obviously it has a fair bit of pincushion distortion, so definitely a win for the Viltrox on that front. So we'll take a look at resolution and contrast next. This is 61 megapixels shown at 200% magnification. We'll start with both lenses wide open. So that's f1.4 for the Art lens, f1.8 for the Lab series lens. So in this case, with both lenses wide open, the Viltrox is slightly sharper and higher contrast in the center of the frame. In the mid-frame, where I would argue that the Sigma is best, it is a really, really close comparison. I think that the Viltrox is still ever so slightly higher contrast, if you look at like the text through this area. But the two lenses are close there. Down into the corners, once again, the competition is very, very close, with hard to call a winner, though I think maybe the contrast for the Sigma lens is very slightly better in the corners. Now, if we stop the Sigma down to f1.8, the center comparison closes to where now I would call them very, very close. In the mid-frame area, it also is very close to being a draw. They are both very good. And down in the corners, I would say now it is the Sigma that is sharper there. Over here on this left side, the Viltrox looks like it has a little bit higher contrast in this kind of middle of the frame zone. And in this upper corner, the two look very, very similar out in this area. Maybe just a little bit more for the Sigma lens. So definitely some give and take with both of them at f1.8. We'll just look at one more aperture, f2.8, where both of these lenses are pretty much perfect, as sharp as they're going to get. That is just a little bit higher for the Viltrox, which, as you can see from the moire there, it's almost popping off the page. It is so sharp and high contrast in the center of the frame. Really, really fantastic. Mid-frame, they both look really, really excellent. And I think the Sigma, at least in this zone, has very much a slight edge, but the two of them are extremely close. Down in the corners, however, it's pretty clear that, at least in this area, that it is the Sigma. Over in this zone where Viltrox was a little bit better before, it's still a little bit better. And up in this corner, the two of them are much more competitive, very, very close. And so, I mean, it's a bit of give and take. I would say that the Viltrox is very slightly more consistently good across the frame. We'll look at one more of these mid-frame areas, and both of them are just amazing. Viltrox is just ever so slightly higher contrast. Now, another area where the Viltrox has a pretty clear advantage is when it comes to minimum focus distance and thus maximum magnification. You can see that the Viltrox's 0.25 times magnification is much, much higher than what we see from the Sigma lens, which is down in the 0.14 times range. So definitely a win for the Viltrox in that metric. And of course, that plays out in the real world, where not only do you get a higher level of magnification, but in this case, although the Sigma has the bigger maximum aperture and thus more potential for blurring out the background at most distances, up close, the Viltrox is going to be the winner, capable of just blurring out the background completely, even though the maximum aperture is a little bit smaller. Sigma claws out a clear win when it comes to the size of the specular highlights, however. And you can see that the bokeh balls, as they're often called, are much bigger and also rounder at the wide open apertures between these two lenses. If I take a look up here at just the contrast to see if there's any kind of fringing, there's a little bit more contrast for the Viltrox lens, but neither one of them is really showing any kind of fringing. The biggest difference here, though, is the size of those specular highlights. I also noted when stopping down here at f2 that the Sigma does a better job of getting that circular shape faster. By f2.8, however, both of them are quite good. Now, the Sigma does have two more aperture blades, 13 versus 11, but we can see that both of them achieve kind of a similar effect when it comes to specular highlights here. Now, this test shows one win for the Sigma lens and one for the Viltrox lens. The Sigma win at f1.4 versus f1.8, as you can see that the background is just softer and creamier than what it is from the Viltrox. However, if we zoom into a pixel level, we can see that the Viltrox is definitely delivering better levels of micro contrast. All of these textures just really stand out with more definition, and even if we stop the Sigma down to f1.8, so apples to apples, the Viltrox is still clearly higher contrast, just better micro contrast in those textures. Here's another situation where I have focused on this area right here, and if we look at these compared, they're pretty close at this point. I wouldn't really call a winner, but when it comes to the softness of the background, we do have a winner in that the lines are just less obvious showing up here. They're just soft. They're not quite as soft looking on the Viltrox, softer on the Sigma, and so that is the advantage for the Sigma because of that larger maximum aperture. In fact, even if we stop the Sigma down to f1.8, I do think it retains a bit of an advantage with the softness here compared to the Viltrox lens. So how about flare resistance? In this case, I've positioned the sun, kind of a typical shot where you might be shooting with maybe the sun setting behind a portrait subject. And you can see here that the two lenses react in similar but not identical levels. There's a little bit of a halo effect on the Sigma lens that's not present on the Viltrox. There's also a little bit more of like almost a light leak type look here of kind of a veiling effect in the bottom right of the image on the Viltrox lens that isn't present there on the Sigma. Now, interestingly, as I stopped the lenses down, I found that the Sigma's effect remained largely the same. And so in this zone of the image, the two look very, very similar. But what we see is that the Viltrox has actually gone to a little bit higher contrast level. So shooting at f2.8, it actually does a little bit less veiling than what the Sigma lens does. These distinctions are really, really minor, so probably not a major difference. We'll conclude by looking at a series of portrait images just to see how they compare in this instance. And so here in a similar type setting and a roughly similar type pose, we can see that if we compare the faces in terms of the detail there, the results are really, really close. Obviously, the lighting is very slightly different here, but as far as the amount of detail that's there, both are very similar. If we look towards the backgrounds here, in this particular image, they are not radically different. I would say that if you looked at these images, you would be excused at least in thinking that they were both shot with the same lens, because there isn't a radical difference. However, I do think that superior geometry for the Sigma does show up as you get towards the sides here. And so it's just a little bit rounder looking in those specular highlights and also a little bit softer, even though both of them are at f1.8. This particular image, however, shows a bigger contrast. And so, number one, if we start at f1.4, so these poses aren't identical. We'll get to the identical pose here in just a moment. You can see that both of them, however, are producing plenty of sharpness for this kind of setting. Where I want to draw your attention, though, is in this zone, which is falling into a transition, a little bit more of a complex area. There's no question that the Sigma looks softer in this zone versus the Viltrox, and so definitely an advantage there. Now, even if we move to an apples-to-apples pose here, and so we can see both of these are now at f1.8, but looking at this area, it still, to my eye, I think looks a little bit softer on the Sigma than what it does on the Viltrox. Now, yes, the lighting isn't identical. That's the problem with doing outdoor tests. There are variations in lighting, so that could potentially be a factor because it's highlighting some of those specular highlights with light that are less so here. But I do think that in general, we're going to find that, again, the backgrounds are just a little bit softer with the Sigma lens. And if we compare looking at sharpness and contrast, even in skin textures, they're very, very different. The color signature isn't identical between the two, but they are extremely close. A second shot here in this series, we can see that, again, you can see those background differences. They are minor, but they do exist. And likewise, when we look at the sharpness and contrast on the face, the skin tones, it is very, very similar. So how about this shot where we've got a nice full length here, and so this is where the advantage of the f1.4 comes into play, just giving you a little bit more of a cutout look from the background. So again, if we look at subjects at this distance, I mean, there's plenty of detail on both. There's a little bit more contrast, micro contrast on the Viltrox if you look in like the hair, but again, you would be perfectly happy with that normally. Looking towards the background, there is that bit of difference where the background is just a little bit softer. The specular highlights are bigger off of the Sigma lens, and that gives a bit of an advantage. Finally, here with both of them at f1.8 in a similar type setting, once again, if we look in at the subject, micro contrast very slightly higher on the Viltrox lens, but they look very, very similar, not a whole lot of difference. And again, if we look at those backgrounds, you see kind of those similar patterns that we have seen where, while there's a little bit of a kind of a soap bubble effect here that's a little more pronounced on the Sigma, and at the same time, I do think that the background is generally softer than what it is on the Viltrox. So that gives you a look at maybe some of the comparative strengths and weaknesses of the two lenses optically. So at the end of the day, hopefully the deep dive into the optical performance has helped you to determine which one of these lenses is going to be the best for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.